When we talk about big life events like getting married, we usually think about love, family, all that good stuff. But there's this whole other side to it, the legal side. And believe me, the law has its own special language, especially when it comes to money and property. So today, we're going to crack that code together. So let's just dive right in with a huge question. When two people get married, should every single thing they own and everything they earn from that point on become shared property? I mean, it's a really personal question, right? But it's also one the law has some very specific answers to, and those answers can completely shape a couple's financial future. Okay, so if we're going to understand how the law handles all this, we first have to get a handle on how the law, speaks. It's got its own unique grammar, and it's built for a very specific purpose. Have you ever noticed how legal language can feel a little cold? Impersonal even? Well, that's completely on purpose. The goal is to be neutral and objective, so it focuses on the rule itself, not the people involved. It's trying to create a system that, in theory, applies the exact same way to everyone. Then the number one tool for getting that neutral tone is something called the passive voice. You probably remember this from English class. So instead of saying, the judge made the decision, the law would say, the decision was made. Do you see how the focus just snaps away from the person and onto the action itself? This is absolutely fundamental to legal writing. Here's a perfect example in action. Assets are divided according to the legal regime. Now, who's actually doing the dividing? Is it a judge? The couple themselves with lawyers? For the sake of the rule, it just doesn't matter. The key information is that the assets are divided. The process is the star of the show, not the people. And here's another one. Separate property is protected by law. The property is protected. The sentence doesn't have to get into the details of who is doing the protecting. Is it the courts, the police, the entire legal system? The important thing, the guarantee, is the protection itself. It's a really powerful way to state a rule with absolute authority. Okay, so besides the passive voice, the law builds its entire logic using conditional sentences. I want you to think of it like a big cause and effect machine. The words if and unless might seem small, but they're incredibly powerful. They're the triggers that set up all the consequences and exceptions. This is your classic if-then structure, right? If a specific thing happens, in this case signing a prenuptial agreement, then a specific legal result follows. The standard rules might go out the window. It creates a really clear path from an action to a consequence. And unless works a little differently, it sets up the exception. The law kind of has a default setting, a standard way of handling things. That default rule will always apply unless a very specific condition is met, like having a different agreement. It establishes the main rule and the only way to get around it. Okay, so we've got the grammar down. Now it's time for the vocabulary. If grammar is the structure of the language, then vocabulary is the code book you need to actually understand what's being said. So let's look at the key terms you'll see in marital property law. First up is legal regime. This one is a big deal. The best way to think about it is as the financial operating system for a marriage. It's the set of rules that governs everything. Different places have different default systems, and they often reflect some really deep cultural values. Now, inside that legal regime, you often find this concept of community property. This is all the stuff, the assets that are acquired during the marriage. Think about salaries, a house you bought together, things like that. The law basically sees this as shared wealth, jointly owned by both spouses. And on the flip side of community property, you have separate property. This is usually the stuff you owned before you ever got married. It can also include very specific things you get during the marriage, like an inheritance that was left just to you, or a personal gift. And finally, the one you've probably heard of, the prenuptial agreement, or prenup. This is a legal contract that lets a couple basically write their own rules. It's how they can choose to bypass the default legal regime and spell out exactly how their assets will be managed, especially if the marriage ends. All right, so we've covered the grammar, and we have the key vocabulary. But what does all this look like in the real world? Let's put it all together. We're going to walk through a simple, hypothetical story to see these ideas in action. So let's just imagine a typical scenario. A couple gets married, they don't sign a prenuptial agreement, which means they're automatically operating under whatever the default legal regime is in their country. After a few years, they decide to get a divorce. So now, the million-dollar question, what happens to all their stuff? Let's start with what they each brought into the marriage. Let's say one person owned a small business before they met, and the other had some personal savings. What happens to all of that? Well, in this case, the law is usually very clear. Since there's no prenup, the default rule just kicks in. And that rule says property that was acquired before the marriage is considered separate property. It stays with the person who originally owned it. Okay, that makes sense. But what about the wealth they built together? You know, the salaries they both earned, the house they might have bought, the investments they made while they were a team. What does the law say about all of that? This is where those assets are treated totally differently. They're considered community property. And hey, listen to that language again. They are divided. There's that passive voice. The default legal regime says that this shared wealth has to be split between them. So, we've seen how the grammar and vocabulary of the law work together to create this very structured system. But just because there are rules, it doesn't mean everyone agrees on them. So now I want to turn it over to you. What do you think is fair? Some legal systems really lean into sharing, seeing marriage as a complete economic partnership. Others are all about protecting what's yours, emphasizing individual ownership. Neither one is right or wrong, they just reflect different cultural values. So which one makes more sense to you? Go ahead and pause for a moment to really think about it. Okay, now let's think about the human side of this. A prenup is a legal document, for sure, but the choice to get one is deeply personal. Is it just a smart, practical way to protect your assets and have some clarity? Or does it kind of send a message that you don't fully trust the relationship to last? You can find strong arguments on both sides.
And all of this really brings us to one final, much bigger question. We love to think of marriage in romantic terms, as a partnership of hearts. But after everything we've talked about, legal regimes, property division, financial rights, is it fair to say that marriage is also an economic partnership? It's a pretty big idea to chew on. Thanks for joining me today.